So let's apply these terms. Let's actually use some examples here. So in this particular case, you look at your phone, you visually see that you have a text message, and you get happy. So let's think about what is the stimulus and what is the response? And secondly, do they have to be learned or do they hold meaning by default? So in this particular case, the thing that is eliciting the response from you is that visual side of the text message. So that is your stimulus. And in this example, and maybe you could argue this, but just for simplicity's sake, this is something that you don't have to learn that you get happiness from seeing a social interaction. This is something that inherently kind of holds emotional meaning by itself. So we consider unconditioned of a stimulus. So this is the thing that elicits the response. So then, by default, feeling excited, picking up your phone, that is the response to that stimulus. And again, not conditioned. We didn't have to learn that in order to interact with social people on our phone, we should pick up our phone. That's kind of just an instinctual thing that we didn't have to condition ourselves to. And again, maybe you could argue this, but just go with me. So what about that ringtone sound? Is it a stimulus or is it a response? And does it have to be learned or does it produce the response by default? Well, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that sound by itself, that ding, doesn't tell you anything. That ding doesn't inherently have any sort of emotional meaning or any sort of internal association with it that you already know, right? You had to learn that ding, that ringtone, is associated with getting a text message. And once you've learned that association, once you've had experience getting a couple texts or getting a couple phone calls, you've now associated that neutral sound of a ringtone with the exciting receipt of a text message. So that's why this sound is conditioned. You had to learn it with experience. And it's a stimulus because it's eliciting a response from you. It's eliciting a behavior. So now we can completely take that text out of the equation, like when you're walking through a busy street and you hear that conditioned stimulus, you hear that ringtone, you're still likely to respond to it, but now it's a conditioned response. You had to learn to have this behavior based off some otherwise neutral stimulus. So same response as before, but this response now is conditioned. It didn't just start as a default response. So let's walk through Pavlov's example, just to kind of break down how this works. So in Pavlov's experiments, here's what happened. Before conditioning, the food, which is your unconditioned stimulus, because you don't have to learn that food is good for you or that food is going to bring you joy. So this food is naturally going to cause the dogs to salivate. They're going to want to crave that food. This is a response. This is a behavior as a result of that stimulus. And you don't have to learn it either. So it's a kind of an involuntary behavior. You're salivating because you want the food. So this is just kind of basic default step one. It occurs without you doing anything. Okay, so one other thing we have to kind of establish before conditioning. We have a tuning fork here, or a metronome, according to your book. Any sort of neutral stimulus is something that does not elicit salivation. To the sound of a metronome or whatever tuning fork is, you're not going to instantly feel that same sort of hunger or sensation for food. So neutral stimulus doesn't cause you a response. This is like baseline default what's happening. So now let's do some conditioning. During conditioning, Pavlov would play the tuning fork or the metronome before he presented the dogs with food. Now he was trying to get the dogs to learn the association that tuning fork predicted food. So again, these are two stimuli that follow sequentially in time. So we're pairing a neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus in order to see if we can kind of create a conditioned response. So over time, and again, this takes multiple trials. It's not something that like a reflex that you just get on the first time that it happens. But after a bunch of trials, these dogs are learning to associate the tuning fork with the receipt of food. So after conditioning, he did that. He was able to condition the dogs to salivate just to the sound by itself. So without even food present at all, the dog still had this internal kind of involuntary physiological behavior change in response to what was a neutral stimulus. So now this has become the conditioned learned stimulus. And now salivation is a conditioned learned response. So this means that learning has occurred. So again, these are kind of complicated terms, but always ask yourself, break down whether you're looking at a stimulus or a response, something that elicits an action or the action itself. And then ask yourself whether or not those particular things had to be learned from experience, they were conditioned, or happened naturally, they were unconditioned. So to practice that, we're going to take a look at another example. So here's a clip from The Office. Love The Office, one of my favorite shows. And it revolves around these employees at a paper company. So we're going to watch a brief interaction with Jim, who is the salesman in blue, and his colleague Dwight over here. So listen, and we will ask you some questions about it.